Welcome, everyone. My name is John Pappas, and welcome to Inference Swap Live. Just want you to know that you can now find our program on YouTube and on our Facebook group live with video and everything. You'll get to see my ugly mug. And this is the program where we talk and break down the presuppositions concerning the gospel and discipleship, which is the thing that our world needs right now. And we're going to talk about more about that later. But first, let's get the business out of the way. Hey, I want to thank you to our sponsor, Barney's Hub Bootery, 1198 North Main Street in Crown Point, Indiana. This is your one-stop shop for all your shoe needs and maybe outdoor clothes and some Under Armour. They got all kinds of stuff going on at this store. And right now, it's BOGO. Buy one and get one half off. So if you buy a shoe, you can get a shoe half off. If you buy a shirt, you can get a shirt half off. Whatever you want to buy, you can get it half off also. Just so you know, this is at 1198 North Main Street, but these people are, they service people because they love people. They're masked up and ready to go. So if you need something, especially in this Northwest Indiana weather where we just had 11 inches of snow and it's freezing below zero, go to this place right now and they will hook you up. Just go there, 1198 North Main Street. Also, guys, I want to encourage you to go to inferenceswap.com and become a premium member. It's just $9.99 a month, but you keep this podcast going and alive. And because you do that, we can give you many different resources. Right now, I'm working on the Gospel and God's Judgment resource, but we just released last week, if you become a premium member, you can have this. My book on audio called Screaming in the Wind is the Religion of Christianity, Keeping People from Christ. Now, this is going to be an amazing book. It is an amazing book, and it'll really challenge you and really challenge what you believe about the gospel and maybe some things that you've felt and considered concerning where today's church is concerning are they doing what God has called them to do and how we go about it. So this is a little bit of a challenge, but it's also an encouragement to get our feet moving towards our neighbors. Now, what's so great about this opportunity is for $9.99, you can go on the Podbean app, which is our podcasting hosting site, even though we are platformed everywhere. If you go to Podbean, you can go there and become a premium member for $9.99 a month, and it keeps this podcast alive, and you'll have access to all the premium content. And this is the deluxe edition, which means in between each chapter, the author gives you some commentary to tell you what he's thinking and feeling about each chapter. So I want to encourage you, go to the website or go to the Podbean app and become a premium member for just $9.99 a month, and it keeps us alive here. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I have a new setup, as you can see in the back. I got some new cameras I'm flipping around just to show you. Yeah, there's me. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm trying to diet right now. This COVID thing has really gotten me crazy as far as eating. And so I'm trying to just, cut off a few pounds, but isn't that what we're always do? It's like, that's the never ending fight, ain't it? And so I want to encourage you, if you're doing the same thing, hey, I feel your pain and I feel where you're at. And I know there's a lot of people also, I wanted to say this up front. I know there's a lot of people also that are, dealing with COVID, or people that know COVID. And I just want you to know that this show prays for you. Me as a pastor and as a missionary, I pray for you. And so we know that I'm glad that some of the people that had this are getting off of it, but I just found out another couple of friends of mine got it. So, what do you do? So what do we talk about today? I just want to encourage you that, this show is about breaking presuppositions down about concerning the gospel and discipleship. So let me say this about discipleship right up front. In COVID, the problem that we have with what churches are doing right now, and I'm telling you, there's a lot of great churches, so don't take this as a negative against the church, but they're trying to replicate the same things they do inside the church in the outside world, thinking that what they're doing in the church is exactly what God had called them to do. Now, of course, it's good to hear a sermon. Now, of course, it's good to sing songs. And of course, it's good to fellowship spiritually with other people. But discipleship is not something that just takes place inside of a building. So the presupposition I want to break about discipleship right now is that while it's good to get away and understand what the gospel is, and so you can use the gospel as a methodology rather than sticking yourself into an assimilation process or a system in a church, what the discipleship really is it's about getting people and going to people to proclaim and seed good news right where they're at. So when you're thinking about discipleship, sure, maybe for a small season, 5-6 weeks or whatever, that you have to get yourself in order to be understand how God's going to use you in your current climate, in your neighborhood, in your coffee shop, at the pub, at the restaurant. Maybe you're meeting with people around softball or baseball or some sport. There's always some place, somewhere, that God is always moving and working on people that you're involved in, that he might lead you to. And the question is, if you were led to them, what exactly would you do? Would you just invite them to a service, or would you yourself invite them into your life? And I think that's the bigger issue. We don't want to invite people into our life. It's easier to give them to a pastor and a system. And the problem with many systems, which is what we're going to get into today, is not getting into systems, but the problem with many systems is it's a system of thought, and we just sort of don't see it is that big of a deal anymore. Back in the day, there was a lot of theological arguments, but now we don't really give a lot of thought to the systems of thought in the various churches that we're involved in. And why I'm bringing that up is because we need to understand the gospel in and of itself. And so a lot of what the gospel shows us and teaches us and demonstrates when we're reading it by these authors, by these gospel writers, and through Jesus himself, challenges the systematic things that we believe and then have just, like, we learned it one day and we don't think about it again. You know what I'm saying? So it's very important. Now, God's judgment is one of those things. Now, later on in the show, I'm going to go through what we've gone through as far as season 2. We've been learning about God's judgment and why that matters to discipleship. And right off the bat, I'll just give you, one of the things, and we're going to talk about it later, but we often have this idea that God is going to separate the wheat and the chaff, and by that we mean we're predefining what the wheat and the chaff is, meaning good people get rewarded and bad people do not. They get punished. They go to hell. Okay, but what we realize, if we have that outlook, then we divide the world into those two categories, to the good and the bad. And the problem with that is we are never on the bad side. We might do something bad, but for the most part, we're going to end up on the good side, right? And so when we're talking about God's judgment, what we're finding out is that at this point in the conversation, which we're on, I think week 7 here, is that Jesus has shown us that he's leveled out the playing field and that he's getting ready to go towards Jerusalem and to that cross and die. And forefront on his mind is the reality of his death and resurrection. And when we're looking at Jesus, and we're going to talk about this next week, but he's living the declaration from eternity and the reality that we're in and seeing us through his eyes of a finished work. And he's about to go finish that work so we can see it. But we're on the stage now where Jesus is now going to Jerusalem. And on the way there, he meets this guy called Lazarus. All right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about the state of Jesus' mind here. But the writer of the gospel, John, this is where we're sort of at today, shows us just how much at this point the hostility between the Judean authorities, the Jewish authorities, and how much hostility they have towards Jesus. In the scriptures, prior to Lazarus, we find some remarkable stuff out. One, we find that Jesus is provoking these authorities and their charges of blasphemy. And this would end up being the basis of all of those Jewish authorities and all of those leaders coming after Jesus, and it would be the basis for them coming in the middle of the night and putting him under arrest and placing him on trial and condemning him to his death. But Jesus isn't running away from that. He's not backing away from it. In some sense, he's provoking these things. And that's because he's literally the God of truth. He is the way, the life, and the truth, right? And we're going to get to that today too, maybe. But the authorities come to him prior to the story of Lazarus, which is where we're heading. We're heading to the story of Lazarus because it's about death and resurrection. And that's what the key to understanding the parables of judgment is. I would say grace as well. So the authorities are coming to him and they're confronting him once again. And so in John 10:24, it says, so the Jews gathered around him and said to him, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you're the Christ, if you're the Messiah, then tell us plainly. Now, let me tell you, man, we're getting late in the game here as far as journeying with Jesus and his mission. And Jesus' answer is so ballsy, I cannot even imagine in any context, you and I, answering modern authorities, who, by the way, have no authority to kill us the way Jesus does. But Jesus says to him, he says, I told you, and you do not believe, that the works I do in my Father's name bear witness about me. And then he states in John 10:30, I and the Father are one. So they're asking him, they're looking to kill him. They're looking to get rid of him. They're looking to trap him, and Jesus doesn't even care. He gives them exactly what they want, and he does tell them the plain, I and the Father are one. The Lord is God, and I am God. I and the Father are one. I am doing his works, and he is doing his works through me. You know what I'm saying? So this raises everything to a new temperature. And once again, these Jewish authorities are furious. They know they have to think about how they need to get him. And despite this, the people are hearing him and seeing what he's doing, and they're believing. So we have this dichotomy between the people, a division, and the authorities that the people are under. Now, I'm going to pause here and rabbit trail, but there's a lot of people in the church world that talk about authority, like John Bevere in his book. And I would say that Jesus was rebellious against authority, and that our authority lies to God and God alone. Now, that doesn't mean we don't love each other and respect each other, but I place no man in authority over me but God alone. And so I reject that kind of understanding, because Jesus himself, he didn't seem to go by this authoritarian, hierarchical, spiritual hierarchy kind of idea. He himself was God in our midst. And because of this, he was rebelling, in their eyes at least, to their authorities, which they deem necessary to keep the people in control. And I'll just say this right now, like, it goes against the people that have prophesied about the new president or the old president or President Trump. These people need to shut up. They're not helping anything. They're not doing anything God is doing. I mean, it's easy to sit in your basement and prophesy on a screen and get a bunch of followers. We all want to feel hyper spiritual. We all want to feel like we're purposed in our work, and therefore, because we're purposed, we're okay. We all want to think that we're participating in our salvation, but those things come through God alone. So it's much better for us to live something than to just proclaim something and live the way we want. So having said that, that was a little bit of a rabbit trail. What we find is that there's a division at this point in the story between the people and the authorities of the time. And accordingly, they grow, the Jewish authorities grow more and more frustrated with Jesus. I mean, they're starting to get pissed, but they don't know exactly what they're to do yet, but they're getting desperate to get him out of the way. In other words, they don't just want to get rid of Jesus. They don't want to just get him out of the way. They don't just want to put him in jail till he's forgotten. They could have done those things, right? They didn't do any of that. Look, I'm going to show you what they really wanted to do. And this matters because Jesus challenges their authority, the principalities of this world. So in Mark 3:6, so what do they want? What is it that they want from Jesus if they do capture him, if they do trap him? Well, this has been going on since the beginning, but listen to Mark, how he puts it. He says, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians, another sectarian group, and they said about how to destroy him. In Matthew 12:14, it says the Pharisees went out and conspired against him about how to destroy him. These are literal words used. In Mark 11, going back to Mark, it says, and the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking a way how to destroy him. Why? Because they feared him, because all the crowd were astonished by his teaching. The gospel writer Luke, he says this in 1947. He says, and he was teaching daily in the temple. So Jesus is with the people. He went to the people. I hope we understand that from a discipleship perspective. It's why I say you cannot be a disciple and stay in a building, living in a church. That's not how it works. Disciples go and make disciples. But getting back on track here, in Luke 19:47, it says, and he was teaching daily. The chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking there to destroy him. Do you see what's going on here? They wanted Jesus destroyed, and they were going to do whatever was necessary to make that happen. Now, I want you to see Jesus as he's presented in the New Testament. We go in our churches and we see these like little happy Jesus with sheep around him and little children and stuff like that. And this is not what's going on. This is not what is presented to us in the New Testament. Of course, there's a little bit of that. But really, Jesus wasn't some teacher who just said some wise things and patted people and laid hands on people and everything was honky-dory and they just killed him for no reason. This was the leader of a heavenly rebellion against the consequences of sin on this world. He was not somebody who separated himself from the world, but came to the world to overthrow death and to save those who were in death's grips by the consequences of sin. For the Bible says, for the wages of sin is death. If you die apart from the living Father, then you will die the death of 1,000 deaths, I guess, because you will die eternally without the living Father. If you choose not the Creator, then you choose something other than the Creator. And you tell me what that is. But Jesus put not only his life on the cross on the line, but every day he put himself on the line before the authorities of this world. He was challenging their message. He was challenging their ideas. He was challenging their theology. He was challenging how they interpreted the Bible. He was challenging what they believed about the Messiah. Remember, he said he was going to do this. Repent, the kingdom of God is at hand. Turn from everything you believe about God and follow me. That's what that means. He was the Messiah who had enemies in high places everywhere he went, from town to town to town. Jesus was the ultimate authority rebelling against their hierarchies, their spiritual structures, and their prophetic spiritual to-do lists, if you will. So this sets up something so profound and unthinkable. The authorities have to kill Jesus. And that is the story we're getting ready to go to, Lazarus being raised from the dead. So they already want to destroy him. Now think about what Jesus does in front of them concerning Lazarus. It's crazy. So what do we know about Lazarus? We've heard the story where, Jesus raises Lazarus. He raises Lazarus from the dead. And we're going to talk a lot about that story next week, but I'm going to take a little turn here. Lazarus is a fascinating character within the writings of the gospel, because one of the weirdest things in Scripture is that he is introduced to us several places, but he never says a single word. And another weird thing is it's obvious that he was a dear and beloved friend of Jesus, the way he's described in these Scriptures. But again, nowhere in Scriptures Lazarus recorded ever saying a single word, although he's introduced to us several times. Lazarus was raised from the dead, and that raising solidified the moment where the Jewish authorities had to act concerning Jesus and act immediately. Now think about that. So this is what we know about Lazarus. Lazarus is fascinating. He's introduced in several places. He's a dear friend of Jesus who followed him around in his ministry. We know that Scripture has no record of Lazarus actually saying anything in all of these stories. But we also know that when Lazarus was raised from the dead, it solidified the moment where it actually unified all the Jewish authorities and everyone who was acting in a sectarian group to act on Jesus now. And I'm going to show you this in John 12, 9 through 11. It says, when the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was in town, they came to him, not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, who he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plan to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. So they were going away from what they believed. I'm assuming that's some kind of Judaism. And they were coming to Jesus and believing the good news of who he is and what he's doing and what he said he was going to do. So concerning Lazarus, it's not only a strange oddity concerning the actual writing of the Gospel of John, but I mentioned previously that Lazarus is never recorded saying a word. So through John 11, the author does go out of his way when he's telling the story of Lazarus being raised to dead. That's in John 11. So when he's telling the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead, the author goes out of this way to establish this unique relationship between Lazarus and Jesus. The author writes about Jesus being deeply moved in verse 33 and how Jesus was angry and upset by the weeping of the mourners and the mourners themselves in verse 35, and how Jesus himself wept in verse 36, and that he describes Jesus by looking at the bystanders saying, well, I should say he describes the bystanders looking at Jesus as everyone's mourning Lazarus' death, and they say, see how he loved them. So why I'm saying that is the gospel writer remarkably assigns Jesus these incredible emotions, which is really, really peculiar. Now, even more remarkable is only after this point, okay, after this story of Lazarus, does the author of the Gospel of John make a series of references to what we call an unnamed disciple, or as an other disciple, or as the famous one is the disciple whom Jesus loved. And there's many scriptures like John 13, 18, 16. John 13 in chapter 18 verses 20. Chapter 20 and chapter 21. There's just a ton of these things, okay? So there's this remarkable reference after this point of an unnamed disciple, or somebody who's called the other disciple, or someone who's called the one whom Jesus loved. And it comes after the story of Lazarus. And the point I'm getting at here is that there is a growing number of scholars who are suggesting that other or beloved disciple is Lazarus. Now think of that. And what makes that so incredible, if that's true, it would change the absolute meaning of the last verse of the Gospel of John and what it means. So you're saying, what is that last verse? The last verse of the Gospel of John, after he's told this whole story, he says, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. This becomes a reference not to John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but to a reference to Lazarus, who was himself brought back to life by Jesus and becomes a theological witness to Jesus' victory as the resurrection in life. Even more astonishing is Lazarus. Lazarus then is the writer of that gospel, the Gospel of John, the fourth gospel. That is amazing. So here, there is a growing consensus that Lazarus could be the one who is the witness of this resurrection and life and what it means to us, and this idea of how God or Jesus himself is walking through the finished work in his life and walking towards the finished work of the reconciliation in his death and resurrection. Isn't that amazing? So how do we put all this together? And that's where I was sort of looking at right now. How do we put all this together? So I'm going to tell the story of Lazarus next week, but I just think it's fascinating that we have this plot to destroy, and not just kill him or put him away, Jesus. They're going to destroy him. And that Lazarus himself becomes the tipping point of them doing it. In other words, it solidifies all the authorities to come after Jesus because everyone's believing in him, right? So as we're talking about the gospel and God's judgment, how does this all come together? And as we look at these writers of the four gospels, we have talked a lot about the parables of the judgment. And all of this is challenging our assumptions that we bring about God and about God's judgment. But what I want to say is it frees us to love as he loves, to walk through challenges knowing that we are never forsaken or alone, to not feel guilty about standing up to the authorities around us that are wicked, that are evil, that are propagating have-tos and don't-dos as all religions do. Right now, I'm rabbit trailing here again. I've been talking a lot on another podcast about the values and politics and policies that we're seeing right now in our community. And I'm doing that because a lot of pastoral ministers have taken the approach to not say anything for the sake of not losing their congregation. And I think that's more because they don't want to lose anybody out of their congregation to keep the doors open. But if you're not discipling in the real world and you're not challenging real thoughts and you're not challenging the reality, then we're just letting these things happen to us. And this whole thing has been about God's judgment. My headphones just literally fell out. Hold on a second. Wow, like I stepped on my headphone jack and it literally fell out. But what I was going to say though, if the gospel and God's judgment, the parables of God's judgment, or the parables of judgment, are challenging what we believe about God's judgment, then wouldn't that affect on how we view the world? In other words, we just figured out that Jesus was in a complete rebellion against the authorities and the principles and the powers of its day that were leading people not to him, but actually preventing people coming to him in his name because they wouldn't do the things that they were doing. Think about that. And now we live in a political climate where they're propagating a bunch of versions of reconciliation called equity. Which is, by the way, equity is not the same thing as repentance. And matter of fact, equity doesn't even call for repentance. It just calls for what is there. They think equity will bring equality, but equality doesn't come like that. Equality can only come through God by understanding that we are God's children. And in light of that, my brothers and sisters are my neighbors, and they're the ones I am my brother's keeper. And I love them because they are children of God, not because they're black or white, not because one has privilege or another, not because of any other reason. So there's a lot of things that I'm doing this because, there's a lot of reasons I'm doing this because it challenges our assumptions which play out in the world. And this has to do with disciple. We have been taught to quote, you can be in the world, does not be a part of the world, but we separate from the world. And we don't go to those in the world and bring them good news. Well, what is good news concerning what we learned today and what we've been learning? Well, I'm going to go through it real quick and wrap it up with this Lazarus thing that we just talked about. But God includes everyone in what he's doing, and that's the first thing we need to remember. Our first podcast was on this. He does not start from excluding people, and he doesn't start from excluding people we don't agree with or dislike. His plan of redemption was for everyone, and his judgment that he took upon himself was for everyone. That brings me to 2. God's judgment is the ultimate offer of grace. We can't get lost. We can get lost in judgment scriptures that are secondary to the writers, like Paul's point. And that's what that one, and I've addressed this before, but Jesus took the wrath of God on our behalf. He didn't die just for the good people, whatever that means. He died for the world. For God so loved the world, he gave his only son. That work of judgment is finished, and now is our offer of grace. Do you see this? This is why the story of Lazarus is so important, because he is the resurrection and the life. He is seeing people through this work. We do not. Our discipleship in modern day churches told us to separate from the world, and if they start showing some interest, somehow to invite them to a service. We are called to bring good news, to be people of good news. We are people, we are the way. God's judgment is a victory by losing for the losers. This is the third podcast we did. We learned that God's judgment is victory by losing for the losers. You see, our human nature is to one-up each other. We want to win at all costs because we've been taught that winning is everything. So we want the big house, the big car, the good job, all the money. And we want all of it to show how incredible we are. But Jesus didn't come with armies and wealth and nation states and political blah, blah, blah. He came to bring a kingdom and seed that kingdom. But in that kingdom, he came to lose, meaning he came to die. And that in that, Jesus identifies with the least of the people, with the lost, the last, and the losers of this world, because he himself came to lose. He brings the overlooked and the lowly hope, because the world has cast them away because of their winning. Think about the Pharisees. Where were the Pharisees as Jesus is approaching all these people, like the women at the well? You know what I'm saying? So how does that change your thinking? He came from the losers. You want to win, lose. Our fourth podcast was God's judgment means he levels the playing field. How does the losers become winners? Well, Jesus judges even while he was living through his death and resurrection. This means there was no one in his eyes that stood before him who was holy or sanctified or better than someone else. All were sinners. All fell short of the glory of God. All were the same in his eyes. The only people that did not understand this were, like I said, the winners. They didn't understand that they needed saving despite their works, what they had, their job, their ceremonies, their rituals. There were no favorites before the Lord. He leveled the playing field. Is that how you look at the world right now? Like the Republicans and Democrats before Jesus are the same? It's tough. Another thing we've talked about is God's grace was dreadful to the winners. And we talked about this through the rich young ruler, who was an example of someone who by every standard of this world was doing everything right, was success, was considered a success, was a winner. He was the one everybody wanted to be like. However, when Jesus confronts him, in other words, Jesus confronts him in his perfection that he thinks he has in his mind, and he stands in front of Jesus, he becomes naked without the things that he thought made him a winner, without the things that he thought him made, the things that he placed his faith in, the things that he thought made him better than everybody else. And when he was confronted before Jesus in his perfection, he loses everything and he walks away from Jesus. And the prize was right there. All he had to do was die to himself and follow Christ. So what did he win? Nothing. He lost everything because he thought he was a winner and he couldn't find Jesus without winning. Think about that. Jesus, the creator of all things, in him and all things were created. In and through all things were created in Jesus. And Jesus invites him into his life, and he doesn't go because he was afraid to lose what he's clung on to in this life. What we learn? The first will be last, the last will be first. In the kingdom, the losers win and the winners lose. We have to understand that. What do you cling on to in this world that prevents you to talk to your neighbor about the good, or to do what God has called you to do? Another one is God's judgment is the grace. God's judgment is that grace and Jesus are the reward. You see, many people have this false understanding about God's judgment, and I keep harping on this on every podcast, because in this false understanding, we separate ourselves from the world. We do not become the people that God called us to be. We do not become his hands and feet. We do not become his body, his arms. We do not walk ourselves across the street. We do not do what God has called us to do, because we believe in the judgment of God, that the righteous get rewarded and the evil people get punished. Excuse me. And this leads us to judge other people that way, to separate the world, to categorize our lives. But Jesus tells us that these judgments are not in line with what he's doing in the world, with his joy, with his rest, and with his peace. Now, in this, we talked about the parable of the laborers, where the main guy, the guy that is the boss, he gives everybody the same reward. But it teaches us that Jesus gives grace and reward not based on our labor, but on what he did. And it's his reward to give. And it's the same reward as Billy Graham. We pedestal guys like Billy Graham. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I remember being at a missionary convention, and I was going to get ordained and stuff, and they brought up this speaker, and they introduced him, and in that introduction, it took 8 minutes to get through his accolades. And I can tell you that no one gives a shit. Just go do what you're called to do. I don't need accolades to do what I'm called to do. We're not trying to impress anybody here. We're trying to live out something and draw other people into it. But we like our spiritual resumes, don't we? The reward is that we get God's grace and we get the Lord himself. We have to understand that there's no spiritual caste system in God's kingdom or in heaven. This brings us to our next one, and I'm wrapping it up here. I know I'm going a little late, but I wanted to wrap this. I wanted to bring this together as we go into the next week's podcast. God's victory is our victory. You know, Paul once said that if Jesus had not been raised from the dead, then our faith is futile, then we misrepresent God, that everyone remains in their sin, and there is absolutely no hope. But did you know hope is dangerous, and the world and its religion want to destroy anything that they cannot have power over? This is what principalities and powers mean. And Jesus, principalities and powers, I wrote about this in my book, they look at Jesus as a way to destroy him, because then they can show you that his hope is not the way, that they are more powerful. Yet Jesus does the one thing that no one expects. He doesn't just overcome these powers and principalities in this world. He reconciles them back to himself to align them the way he needs them to be aligned, to do the things he's going to do, so that no thing can have power over us, that we will always be free. He teaches us to live as new creation. The story of Lazarus is part one that gives new life and new hope, because Jesus will raise us from the death and nothing will have victory over us. Think about that. Jesus raises people from death. And because Lazarus himself not only experienced this, but watched Jesus accomplish this, whoa, how about hope there? How about knowing that God is with us in the moment, in eternity? He's covered our past, he's covered our present, he's covered our future. No matter what you're going through. To my friends with COVID out there, God will not forsake you. You are covered no matter what happens. Place your faith there. Do what you got to do. Go to the doctor. Take the medicine. Do all those things. But know that it is God who is our healer, our provision, our provider. He is the one, the way, the truth, and the life. This is what the story of Lazarus gives us today. He is the hope. Lazarus is a witness in his life of the resurrecting power of Jesus in the now. And he's also a witness that Jesus himself overcame all the principalities and the powers of this world by his blood on the cross and resurrected and overcame death and sin to give us resurrection and life. Come on, man. This is what I'm talking about. But if we view things in categories, in and out, good people get rewarded, evil people get punished, then we're not understanding this gospel, and we will not do what God has called us to do. It's why I'm taking the time to do this up front in this season. So I want to encourage you, put your hope in Jesus. Place your faith in the one who's overcome all things, because he is the one that brings freedom, healing, love, and life. All right, I am going to shut up here. I hope this really encourages you. I know I went through a lot of different things, but if you haven't been caught up, you're caught up now, right? And if you didn't know the gospel, I hope you're starting to see that what God has done has been, even in his death, was an offer of life. And even in our death, if we come to him, we will have life because of his resurrection. Come on. All right, so next week we're going to continue in our story of Lazarus, but I want to encourage you to go read something. I never do this, but this week, as you're thinking about what I said here today, and maybe you're going to go through some other podcasts that I've done in season 2 here concerning this, I want you to read 1 Corinthians 15. It will bless you. It will bless you. It's Paul talking about the resurrection, about Jesus and what he accomplished and what it means if you don't believe it. Come on. All right, so guys, I want to encourage you to keep your eyes on the Lord and know that his victory makes us losers winners. Come on. So this is me saying goodbye. But before I say goodbye, one last thing. I want to encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. You can see this podcast right here, right now. Go to our Facebook channel. If you don't have a YouTube, go to our Facebook group, and you can see it there. Or go to our any podcasting app that you had, and you can listen to the audio version of this. We love you. We thank you for listening to our Inference Swap, the place where we break down presuppositions of the gospel and discipleship. Be blessed until I see you next week. We love you, and I will see you again. Bye-bye now.
Wishing I was back where I began, back when I had a peace of mind. Give me back to a simple kind of life. I know I fought a good fight against my self-foolish pride. Take shot just to feel the burn. Teach my soul to live better. I've been feeling like dust in the wind, drinking from the bottle that's half full of sin, looking up when I should look within, chasing angels, demons won't let me in. Angels, demons won't let me in. Won't let me in. No salvation, preservation, work towards condemnation. Need redemption.